Sheldon Johnson, once a gang leader turned advocate, was arrested for a brutal murder, just weeks after sharing his redemption story on Joe Rogan's podcast. How did it all go so wrong? Stick around to find out, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories and updates. Sheldon Johnson was born in Harlem in 1975 into a household where both of his parents were deaf. His early life was shaped by the challenges of growing up in poverty and navigating a world where communication within his family was limited by their disabilities. His parents, unable to hear or speak, faced difficulties not only in raising their children but also in providing stability in a tough neighborhood. Harlem in the 1970s and 80s was a community struggling with high crime rates, drugs, and economic hardship, and this environment left a lasting impression on young Sheldon. From an early age, Johnson was aware of his family's troubled history with the law. His father had been incarcerated for over a decade, a fact that became a backdrop to his childhood. His grandfather had also served time in prison, continuing a generational cycle of involvement in crime. Johnson would later describe this as intergenerational incarceration, a pattern that seemed ingrained in his family history, passed down like a grim legacy. The family's ties to the criminal justice system weren't just a statistic. They were personal and deeply formative. Even his great-grandfather had been enslaved, adding another layer of inherited trauma to the family's story. This sense of hardship and entrapment seemed to define Sheldon's upbringing. Growing up in a household where his parents couldn't communicate verbally with him or the outside world added to the isolation and frustration he felt. Johnson often described feeling invisible, unheard not only by society but also by his own mother, who couldn't physically hear him. As the only member of his immediate family with functional hearing, Johnson was forced to take on adult responsibilities far beyond his years. By the age of 12, he was already involved in his father's illicit activities, translating drug deals for him. This was not a choice Sheldon made willingly, but more of a necessity. His father relied on him to bridge the communication gap between himself and the dangerous world of drug trafficking. For a child, this responsibility was overwhelming, pulling him deeper into a life that seemed inevitable. The economic conditions in Harlem, coupled with his family's criminal past, further limited Johnson's opportunities. Schools were underfunded, crime was rampant, and the drug trade was often seen as the quickest way to make money in an environment with few alternatives. Sheldon's introduction to crime was not glamorous or thrilling. It was a matter of survival, both for himself and his family. Watching his father conduct drug deals and being part of that process as a child normalized the idea that crime was a way of life. By his teenage years, it was clear that Sheldon was on a dangerous path. His early involvement with the Bloods started with small tasks, acting as a lookout or messenger, but it wasn't long before he was fully initiated into the gang. In this environment, crime was not just a way to earn money, it was a way to gain respect, power, and protection. The Bloods provided a sense of belonging and identity that Johnson lacked in other parts of his life. The gang filled the void left by his troubled family situation and the poverty that had surrounded him since childhood. By his late teens, Johnson's criminal activities began to escalate, and he gained a reputation within the gang for his reliability and willingness to carry out orders. As his status within the Bloods grew, so did his involvement in increasingly serious crimes. His early run-ins with the law were for relatively minor offenses: drug possession, petty theft, and disorderly conduct. These charges were typical for young men in his position, and for a time, he managed to avoid serious consequences, cycling in and out of juvenile detention and probation. However, this pattern of criminal behavior began to intensify as Johnson became more deeply entrenched in the gang. By his early 20s, Johnson had risen to a leadership position within the Bloods. His ability to navigate the complex and often dangerous world of gang politics earned him respect both within his gang and among rival groups. Leadership in the Bloods meant overseeing drug distribution networks, ordering violent retaliation against enemies and maintaining discipline within the ranks. Johnson's leadership role also meant that he was no longer just committing crimes himself, he was directing others to do so as well. He became what he described as the top of the food chain within his gang, responsible for decisions that impacted the lives of many, both inside and outside the Bloods. Despite his growing power within the gang, Johnson's criminal activities continued to bring him into conflict with the law. What began as minor offenses evolved into more serious charges, including weapons possession and violent crimes. His reputation as a leader of the Bloods made him a target for law enforcement, and he was frequently under surveillance. It was only a matter of time before his escalating criminal behavior caught up with him in a significant way. The turning point came in 1999 when Johnson was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including armed robbery and attempted murder. According to court records, Johnson and several other gang members committed an armed robbery in Manhattan, during which one of the victims was severely injured. The robbery was intended to send a message to a rival gang, and Johnson's role as the orchestrator of the crime made him a key target for prosecution. During the incident, Johnson allegedly brandished a firearm and participated in the violent assault of the victims, one of whom suffered a head injury that required stitches. This crime marked a significant escalation in the severity of his offenses, moving him from petty criminal activity to violent felonies. At trial, the prosecution argued that Johnson was not just a participant in the robbery, but the mastermind behind it. His leadership within the Bloods and his history of violent behavior were used against him, painting a picture of a dangerous individual who posed a serious threat to the community. The evidence against Johnson was strong, and he was ultimately convicted of armed robbery, attempted murder, and several other charges. In June 1999, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his crimes and his long history of criminal activity. After being sentenced to 50 years in prison in 1999 for armed robbery and attempted murder, Sheldon Johnson's life took a significant turn. Though originally facing what seemed like a lifetime behind bars, his 25 years in prison would come to be marked by a dramatic shift in his behavior and outlook on life. Johnson, once entrenched in the world of gangs and violence, claimed to have found a path to personal transformation during his time in the penal system. When Johnson first entered prison, it was the beginning of a long and harsh sentence. He found himself in a highly structured environment where violence, isolation, and survival instincts were at the forefront. Prison life is often described as a place where individuals either deteriorate further into criminal behavior or take steps toward rehabilitation. Johnson would later reflect that his initial years in prison were difficult, but they also provided him with a chance to reflect on his past actions and decide if he wanted to continue down the same destructive path. In prison, Johnson began his journey toward self-improvement, first by focusing on education. He earned his GED while incarcerated, marking his first major step toward rehabilitation. Johnson realized the importance of education not just as a way to pass the time, but as a means to rebuild his life and reshape his identity. Earning his GED was just the start. With time and determination, Johnson enrolled in further educational programs and eventually earned a bachelor's degree in behavioral science. This achievement was no small feat in an environment like prison, where access to educational resources can be limited and distractions are constant. Johnson's degree in behavioral science played a pivotal role in his transformation. It allowed him to study human behavior, psychology, and the factors that contribute to criminality and violence. His education became the foundation for his personal rehabilitation, as he began to understand the psychological and societal forces that had shaped his own life and led him to a life of crime. This newfound knowledge gave Johnson a sense of purpose and a desire to change, not just for himself, but for others who were caught in similar cycles of violence and crime. As he continued to grow and learn, Johnson took on a more active role in helping others within the prison system. He became an advocate for rehabilitation, using his own experiences and education to assist fellow inmates. Johnson began working in the prison's law library, helping inmates with legal matters such as filing appeals and navigating the complex legal system. He was known for offering advice and support to those who were struggling, sharing his knowledge to help others fight for their rights or seek leniency in their cases. Beyond legal work, Johnson also served as a mentor to younger inmates. Having risen to a leadership position within the Bloods gang in his youth, he understood the mindset of many gang-affiliated prisoners. He recognized that many were trapped in the same cycle of violence and hopelessness that had once defined his life. Johnson would spend time talking with younger men, encouraging them to pursue education and make better choices for their future. He shared his own story of transformation, hoping that others might follow a similar path. One of Johnson's most significant contributions during his time in prison was the founding of FICAR, formerly Incarcerated Citizens Against Recidivism. This organization was established with the goal of reducing recidivism rates and dismantling the pipeline of mass incarceration that disproportionately affected communities of color, especially in urban areas like Harlem. Through FICAR, Johnson aimed to create programs and support networks for individuals who had been released from prison, helping them reintegrate into society and avoid falling back into crime. FICAR's mission was deeply personal for Johnson. He knew firsthand how difficult it was to break free from the cycle of crime and incarceration. By providing resources like job training, mentorship, and education, FICAR sought to give formerly incarcerated individuals a second chance. Johnson believed that the system had failed many of these individuals, offering little in terms of rehabilitation or support once they were released. FICAR was his attempt to fill that gap, to offer hope and guidance where there had previously been none. Through his work with FICAR, Johnson also became involved in broader criminal justice reform efforts. He advocated for changes in sentencing laws, particularly for nonviolent offenders, and pushed for more rehabilitative programs in prisons. Johnson believed that incarceration should not just be about punishment, but about offering individuals the opportunity to change their lives. He argued that many of the men he met in prison were capable of rehabilitation, but the system offered little in the way of support to help them succeed. His work with FICAR was driven by this belief, as he fought to give others the same chance for transformation that he had found. Sheldon Johnson's 25 years in prison were not without their challenges, but they were marked by a significant shift in his life's direction. From earning his GED and bachelor's degree to founding FICAR and mentoring fellow inmates, Johnson's time behind bars became a story of personal redemption and advocacy for others. While prison had once been a place where he might have withered away, Johnson chose instead to use it as an opportunity to rebuild his life and help others do the same. His story became one of hope and change, a stark contrast to the violent life he had once lived. Once out of prison, Johnson wasted no time stepping into his new role as a public advocate for criminal justice reform. His experiences behind bars, coupled with his education in behavioral science, gave him a unique perspective on the issues plaguing the system. He began speaking out on the need for reform, particularly around the treatment of inmates, the lack of rehabilitation programs, and the challenges faced by individuals after they are released from prison. Johnson's message was clear. The system needed to focus not just on punishment, but on giving people the tools and opportunities to change their lives. One of Johnson's most high-profile moments came in February 2024, when he appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience, a popular podcast with millions of listeners. This appearance marked a major step in his rise as a public figure. During the podcast, Johnson spoke candidly about his life of crime, his time in prison, and the steps he took to rehabilitate himself. He recounted his early involvement with the Bloods, his rise to a leadership position within the gang, and the crimes that led to his long prison sentence. But he also highlighted the turning point in his life, when he decided to pursue education, leave behind his gang affiliations, and commit to helping others. Johnson's conversation with Joe Rogan delved deeply into his philosophy on rehabilitation and second chances. He discussed how prison could either break a person or serve as a place for growth, depending on the opportunities available. Johnson expressed frustration with the lack of meaningful rehabilitation programs in most prisons and called for changes that would help inmates learn skills, pursue education, and prepare for life after incarceration. His message was both personal and broad, addressing not just his own journey but the broader systemic issues that kept so many people trapped in cycles of crime and recidivism. Johnson's story of transformation resonated with many listeners, and his appearance on the podcast helped to raise awareness about the work he was doing since his release. His advocacy wasn't just theoretical. He had already begun working on the ground to help at-risk youth avoid the mistakes he had made. After his release, Johnson joined Queens Defenders, a public defender organization that provides legal representation to individuals who cannot afford an attorney. His role there was multifaceted. He worked with at-risk youth, many of whom were on the verge of being pulled into gang life or criminal activity, just as he had been decades earlier. At Queens Defenders, Johnson focused on mentorship and advocacy, using his own life as an example to teach young people about the consequences of their choices. He also worked with formerly incarcerated individuals, helping them navigate the difficult process of re-entry into society. This included offering support for job training, education, and legal advice. Johnson believed that breaking the cycle of recidivism required more than just good intentions. It needed practical solutions, and he was determined to be part of those solutions. In his work with at-risk youth, Johnson drew on his experiences as a gang member and prisoner to connect with young people who were struggling with similar challenges. He understood the pressures they faced and the allure of gang life in impoverished communities. His message to them was simple but powerful. There is another way, but it requires making hard decisions and rejecting the path that seems easiest in the moment. Johnson's personal story of redemption gave him credibility in this role, and he quickly became a respected figure within the Queens Defenders organization and the broader criminal justice reform community. Throughout 2023 and 2024, Johnson continued to speak at events, share his story with the media, and advocate for meaningful changes within the criminal justice system. He focused particularly on reducing recidivism rates, pushing for policies that would provide education, job training, and mental health support to inmates both during and after their time in prison. Johnson's work was rooted in the belief that everyone deserved a second chance and that with the right support, people could change their lives just as he had. By the time of his appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast in early 2024, Johnson had already established himself as a prominent voice in the movement for criminal justice reform. His message, fueled by his own experiences, was clear. The system could not continue to focus solely on punishment. Instead, it needed to embrace rehabilitation and offer people the chance to rebuild their lives. For Johnson, his work with Queens Defenders and his public speaking engagements were just the beginning of what he hoped would be a lifelong commitment to helping others break free from the cycle of crime and incarceration. In March 2024, Sheldon Johnson, who had recently gained attention as a criminal justice reform advocate, was arrested and charged in connection with the brutal murder of Collin. The crime shocked the public not only because of its grisly nature, but also because of Johnson's recent efforts to present himself as a reformed figure following his release from prison. The incident took place on March 5, 2024, inside Collin Small's apartment in the Bronx. Neighbors in the Highbridge neighborhood reported hearing multiple gunshots coming from Small's apartment early in the morning. According to police reports, 2 gunshots were heard, followed by a brief pause, and then 2 more shots. One neighbor claimed to have heard a man pleading, "Please don't, I have a family," before the final gunshots rang out. After the gunfire stopped, there was an eerie silence in the apartment. Concerned about what they had heard, the neighbors called 911 to report the disturbance. Police arrived at the scene later that day to conduct a wellness check. When officers knocked on Small's door, it was Sheldon Johnson who answered. Johnson allegedly told the police that Small was not home and had gone upstate. However, police found this explanation suspicious given the reports of gunfire earlier in the day. Detectives decided to search the apartment. What they found inside was horrifying. In a large plastic bin, police discovered a human torso. The body was later confirmed to be that of Collin Small, who had been shot multiple times before being dismembered. Police immediately detained Johnson at the scene, and the investigation expanded to include his Harlem residence. When detectives arrived at Johnson's Harlem apartment, they made another gruesome discovery. Inside a freezer, police found several of Small's body parts, including his arms, legs, and head. The body parts were carefully wrapped and stored, leading investigators to believe that Johnson had taken steps to conceal the crime. Small's head had been shot, consistent with the gunshot wounds reported by neighbors, confirming that he had been killed by a firearm before being dismembered. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged that implicated Johnson in the crime. Surveillance footage from the apartment building in the Bronx showed Johnson entering and exiting Small's apartment several times on the night of the murder. In the footage, Johnson was seen wearing different disguises each time he left the apartment. At one point, he was captured on camera wearing a blonde wig, sunglasses, and a large overcoat. On another occasion, he wore a different set of clothing, attempting to conceal his identity. Most notably, the surveillance footage showed Johnson carrying large garbage bags and a blue plastic bin, the same bin in which Small's torso was later found. In one instance, he was seen carrying cleaning supplies into the apartment. This suggested to investigators that Johnson may have been attempting to clean up the crime scene after the murder. The various disguises, along with the efforts to clean the apartment and transport body parts to his Harlem home, pointed to a premeditated effort to hide evidence and avoid detection. On March 6, 2024, Sheldon Johnson was arrested at the scene of a gruesome crime. Police were called to the Bronx apartment of Collin Small after neighbors reported hearing gunshots. Upon arrival, officers conducted a wellness check and found Johnson at the apartment. When questioned, Johnson told police that Small was not home and had gone upstate, but officers found his response suspicious given the earlier reports of gunfire. Deciding to search the apartment, they made a horrifying discovery. Small's dismembered torso was found in a plastic bin inside the residence. With this evidence in hand, police immediately detained Johnson at the scene. As detectives continued their investigation, they conducted a search of Johnson's Harlem apartment where they found additional body parts, including Small's head, arms, and legs, stored in a freezer. The discovery of these remains further implicated Johnson in the crime, and he was officially arrested and charged. Johnson faced several serious charges: murder, manslaughter, criminal possession of a weapon, and concealment of a human corpse. The murder charge stemmed from the fatal shooting of Collin Small, as investigators confirmed that Small had been shot multiple times before being dismembered. The manslaughter charge was included based on the violent and reckless nature of the crime. The criminal possession of a weapon charge came from the firearm used in the shooting, while the concealment of a corpse charge related to Johnson's attempts to hide Small's body parts across two different locations, Small's apartment and his own residence. After his arrest, Johnson was escorted out of the police precinct where he made a brief statement to reporters. As he was led away in handcuffs, Johnson proclaimed, "I'm innocent," maintaining that he had not committed the crime. This declaration of innocence marked the beginning of what would be a contentious legal battle, as Johnson entered a plea of not guilty to all charges during his arraignment. Despite his plea, Johnson was remanded into custody, meaning he was denied bail and would remain in jail until his trial. The severity of the charges, along with the overwhelming evidence, particularly the discovery of the dismembered body parts, contributed to the decision to keep him in custody. Johnson's defense team prepared for the upcoming trial, but the case was already drawing significant media attention due to the brutal nature of the crime and Johnson's public persona as a criminal justice reform advocate. Johnson's arrest stunned many who had followed his recent public appearances. Just a month earlier, he had been a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he talked about his life of crime, his time in prison, and his journey to rehabilitation. Now, he was facing charges of murder, dismemberment, and the concealment of a human body. The contrast between the public figure advocating for reform and the man accused of such a heinous crime raised questions about his true character and whether his claimed rehabilitation had been genuine. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling and want to stay updated on more true crime cases, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. See you in the next video.